Welcome to the Rock's Back Pages podcast. I'm Barney Hoskins. I'm in our Hammersmith offices with my colleagues Mark Pringle.
Hi, Barney.
And Jasper Mirriston Bowie.
Hello, Barney.
And we're here to talk about everything that's new in the world's largest archive of music journalism. And joining us for this episode is Guardian columnist Andy Beckett. Hi, Andy. Welcome.
Hi, Barney.
Great to see
nice
you.
to have me here.
Wait, hold off before you sort of celebrate.
Reserve your judgment. For our listeners, Andy's been writing about politics and pop culture since 1993 and is the featured writer on this week's Rock's Back Pages homepage. He is also the author of 3 terrific books, Pinochet in Piccadilly, When the Lights Went Out, and Promised You a Miracle. Andy, we want to ask you about your career and more generally about the relationship between politics and pop. First of all, I just wanted to quote the last sentence of your Rock's Back Pages bio, which states, "He still buys music with a weakness for 70s Miles Davis and 80s albums on SST." I don't know when you wrote that, because I can't remember exactly when we added your work to Rock's Back Pages, but I'm guessing it's probably 3 or 4 years ago. You still buy albums by Miles Davis and Black Flag?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of expanded into John Coltrane as well now. So through the pandemic, I used to go on these kind of walks into Soho from Hackney, where I live, and go to the various shops that were still extant and buy very cheap John Coltrane albums, kind of almost one by one. Yeah, no, I'm afraid I'm becoming a kind of typical middle-aged man, sort of liking jazz and then, a bit of punk nostalgia, but I live in a Cafe Otto in Hackney, so I do see quite a lot of new music there, but those are not things I tend to buy. It's more things I just go to hear.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not totally fogey-ish. My son is...
By the end of this episode, you might be.
My son is very into kind of 80s and early 90s hip-hop, and I've got lots of that from previous lives, and so I occasionally have moments of impressing his friends where they kind of pull out my... Public Enemy vinyl or whatever.
Nice. Yes.
Nice. So I have a tiny bit of credibility in the family music culture, but only a little.
When and how did you first get into music? Do you remember?
I mean, I was born in 1969, so I kind of first got into music properly very beginning of the 80s, really. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of that English electronic pop music, really kind of soft cell, and then ABC, I guess, less electronic. But that kind of stuff, I really, really like that, quite dramatic. Mm-hmm. Kind of English synthesizer pop. That was my first, and I used to, tape stuff off the radio. I wasn't buying it at that point, but that was my kind of beginning.
Right.
And yeah, I like the drama of it, and I like the way it's quite concise, and it seemed quite modern as well.
Yeah.
At that stage, when I was 11 or 12, I didn't want stuff that had been made in the 60s, and as we know, that stuff was much harder to get then as well. So in a way, you couldn't access older pop music as easily.
Yes.
So yeah, I was very passionately into that kind of stuff. And then when I was a bit older, sort of 14, 15, then I got more into kind of, guitars and Lloyd Cole and things like that. And at my school, at secondary school, a lot of people I knew were goths. And I had kind of contempt for them in a kind of grand way and thought that I was much more adventurous because I liked things on SST records from America, and I thought goth was all a bit kind of tame. I may not think that now, but I quite like Bela Lugosi's Dead. I quite like that song, but that's a bit better, I think.
Bela Lugosi's dead. The bats have left the bell tower. The victims have been bled. Red velvet lines. The black box. Bela Lugosi's dead.
Yeah, it was kind of electronic music, and then it was kind of guitars, and then once I was at university, which in the late 80s, then it was kind of rave culture and that whole thing. And I've always kind of liked sound. I've always been interested in what it sounds like. It has always been the most exciting thing. I think it took me a long time. Maybe I needed to kind of grow up a bit to realise that lyrics were really important as well. But for a long time, it was almost like if it sounded interesting, that was what kind of drew me in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still that way. I'm not sure I know this a complete lyric to a single song.
You still never listened to a single lyric in the history of rock and roll.
I mean, bits drifting, but for me, it's always been actually just the sonic.
I sort of agree to some degree. I mean, I think what's the point? If it's primarily about the lyrics, well, you can read them, you can read books, you can read poetry, and so music is surely above all about sound.
Yeah, and I think maybe especially in that time, from the sort of 70s to the 90s, where sound could change quite quickly because the technology was changing quite quickly. So things could sound totally different
Yeah.
3 years later than how they sounded before,
Yeah.
and that's quite exciting to follow. And obviously there's still change now, but I'd argue maybe sound-wise the change is more incremental, at least in Western kind of pop music. I think it's not maybe changing as fast as it was then, but maybe that's not right.
I disagree purely because I'm starting to hear stuff for the first time. I can say for a long time I'm hearing stuff I've never heard before. And also, I think, as you're talking about kind of hip-hop, but I think that what hip-hop did was set a whole train of ways of making records, which is continuing to this day. And the other thing is, of course, is pointing at Jasper's laptop, the ubiquity of laptops. I mean, things like grime couldn't exist without cheap PCs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you write any, like, music journalism per se before you... The earliest pieces we've got from, like, 93... The Skrill Marcus interview. Did you write any music journalism as such?
When I was at university, I worked for a student paper that me and some friends had set up in quite a Thatcherite kind of way. We set up our own paper, and I wrote quite a lot about music for that.
What was that called?
It was called The Word. No connection to the TV
No
program.
connection.
They copied us.
the magazine.
They copied us.
Yeah.
We claim.
Right.
Yeah, so I wrote about music a bit then because I obviously like music, and then I went to California to do a journalism sort of professional degree because I wanted to be in California for a couple of years, and I think it almost seemed like the obvious. I know about music, so I'll start there. And I was living in Berkeley, where Graham Marcus obviously lives, and so that was kind of the first big piece I did for a British paper because I was like, oh, he lives up the road. If I ask him nicely, maybe he'll talk to me. So I had, after that piece, I had a brief phase of thinking maybe I'll be a music writer for a newspaper, and I did some other pieces for the Independent on Sunday about music. But then I think I kind of realised quite quickly I love music, but maybe I want that to be a pleasure rather than a professional thing.
Yeah.
And also, I kind of thought, do I want to sit in the room with a lot of musicians for the rest of my life? I'm not deriding musicians, but I kind of thought, I'm not a musician myself. I just kind of thought, have I almost got the confidence to do that?
Yeah.
And I think that was part of it. So had I been offered a job as a kind of music critic, then obviously I would have taken it. But I think quite rapidly I thought, actually, this is just going to be a thing I'm into rather than what I write about.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But then since then, I've written about it intermittently ever since. And I quite like journalists as a reader who have unexpected interests. So if someone thinks, oh, Andy Beckett's a rather earnest political journalist, if they then see I know all about, hardcore in the early 80s, that might intrigue them, because as we'll get onto, there's a really interesting kind of porous boundary between what is and isn't political and music that is overtly political and is more subtly political. And in political writing that I've done, I've never been a kind of Westminster correspondent. I've always wanted to expand the definition of what political is as widely as possible. So to me, it's very much about culture and kind of etiquette and psychology as much as it's about who's got a majority in Westminster.
Yeah.
So retaining some interest in music is really important, I think, for me professionally.
You are one of my favourite Guardian columnists, really, for those reasons. Having said that, I read both When the Lights Went Out and Promised You a Miracle without knowing that you were into music at all. I mean, even though there are musical references in Promised You a Miracle, the title, of course, is a Simple Minds track. But I wouldn't have known about, your interest in SST records. Once I did, we have to get Andy on RBP. But I always love your columns in The Guardian, I think, because they don't feel like they come from inside the Westminster echo chamber.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing down people who do that job because I think it's really important that you have some, political correspondents and columnists who know exactly what's happening in the shadow cabinet at any given minute. That's really important.
I mean, I think Pereira, your colleague in The Guardian, who at the Mirror broke some of the biggest political stories of the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
Extraordinarily important.
Absolutely. And that's a very difficult, complicated job, maintaining alliances and sources and all that kind of stuff. It's very hard knowing how far to push it. But I guess I've always been someone where, although I've written about politics for a long time, I kind of tend to think each piece I write, I'm not trying to maintain my network of kind of allies. It's like I just write the piece, and if they don't like it, then I'll just write about something else.
Yes.
And it's interesting what you said, Barney, about how you didn't realise I was so into music previously, because when I did this book about the 1970s, when the lights went out, even though clearly that's an incredibly rich time for music, part of the project of the book was almost to say, let's write about the 70s and not write about popular culture all the time, because I think often, in a slightly lazy way, people write about that decade through popular culture and actually don't even know who was Prime Minister when that record was made. And so in a kind of slightly revisionist way, I thought, there are musical references in the book, but I'm not going to say The Clash explain Britain in 1978 or whatever, because although they do in some ways, I would have argued when I wrote the book, actually who was Chancellor then or what the SWP were up to was equally important, or if not more.
It was an extraordinary period politically in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, it really was. I remember all too vividly. I mean, you could argue that the point where politics and pop music sort of conjoined was when those guys wrote the letters to the music press about Eric Clapton on stage and his racist comments, which started Rock Against Racism. Is that how you would sort of see that?
Yeah, I think that is really, really important. I mean, I wrote about that movement in When the Lights Went Out, and as soon as I got the magazine that they produced, Temporary Hoarding, out of the British Library Archives, I was very excited because I thought the kind of graphic design of it was really kind of modern and interesting. Yes. It wasn't like a kind of granola kind of leftism. It was more modern, and I think there is, if you're my age, I'm early 50s, so to me, Rock Against Racism seems not massively different from the kind of Glastonburys that I've been to and that kind of thing. But prior to that, you're right, it was quite unusual for bands to kind of form coalitions in quite such a sort of focused way.
Oh, well, I think there was actually a revulsion of standard politics which runs through from the sort of hippies through to the mid-70s, that's what the man does, and we're above all that. And it's about psychedelics and sort of recreating your inner self and so on and so forth. I'm very selfish, in the sense that we both loved the singer-songwriter period, but that was a very inward-looking stretch. Yeah. Though, of course, Jackson Browne was a leading proponent of no nukes in America, but he was right out of that sort of self-obsessed thing.
So I thought it was worth just quoting from that letter which you added to RBP some years ago, 28th of August 1976, letter to Sounds. I don't know if there were letters to the other papers as well.
I think the NME may have printed one, but we've certainly got the Sounds one.
And so we took Enoch Clapton ? And it was just after Clapton had a sort of drunkenly railed against immigrants from the stage in Birmingham.
Was it Birmingham or Wolverhampton? I can't remember.
I think it was Birmingham, and he quoted Enoch Powell's notorious Rivers of Blood speech. And this letter then came into Sound and was published. What's going on, Eric? You've got a touch of brain damage. So you're going to stand for MP and you think we're being colonised by black people? Come on. You've been taking too much of that Daily Express stuff. You know you can't handle it. It's fantastic. Rock was and still can be a real progressive culture, not a packaged mail-order stick-on nightmare of mediocre garbage. We want to organise a rank-and-file movement against the racist poison in rock music. We urge support. All those interested, please write to Rock Against Racism, Box M, 8 Cotton's Gardens, London, E2 8DN.
Which sounds like Hackney to me.
Yes. So, I wanted to really ask you about that period. So you talked about first starting to listen to things like Soft Cell, I guess it was 81. So I'm particularly interested in the late 70s and early 80s. And one of the pieces by you that we're featuring on the homepage is your long London Review of Books review of Simon Reynolds's post-punk book, Rip It Up and Start Again. And that is sort of where I came in as a writer too. So I do have very nostalgic feelings about everything that was going on, everything you talk about, feminism, the incorporation of kind of dub and things into music. And it was all pretty right on, and it was all Rough Trade, and Rough Trade was run as a sort of collective. So do you see that post-punk era as a sort of high watermark in the kind of relationship between music and politics?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're right, because a lot of the artists, Gang of Four, or less overtly someone like Everything But the Girl, were political, and that's part of it. But I also think there's something really interesting in that time, which Simon Reynolds in his book, which is a fantastic book, gets into, which is that I think there's a kind of ambiguity to a lot of the musicians' politics in that time. And you see a kind of a modernity and a kind of glossiness coming into the sound that is almost working against the professed political positions. And in Promised You a Miracle, I interviewed Martin Fry about this, and he was really interesting about it, saying that, although they were very much on the left and that was very much where they were, but they were kind of wanting to make music that was more commercial
Sure.
ultimately, and they were sort of almost becoming Thatcherite unconsciously.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of the bands, the changes that happened from the late 70s to the early 80s, you see that you know, someone like Scritti Politti, that's
Yes,
really obvious.
absolutely.
Where they go from all kind of abrasive to being all glossy. But even in a more subtle way, you know, I think even in someone really dark, like kind of Joy Division, there's a kind of spaciousness and there's a sort of modernity in the sound,
Sure.
which you could see as being, it's all, you know, post-industrial desolation, and clearly it's partly that. But I think it's also a sort of message that Britain is about to change quite rapidly, and quite a lot of post-punk innovation, as we all know, then was kind of co-opted, if you like, or, you know, by people who became huge stars like U2 or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting time where it tells you that musicians can be overtly political in a way that's very ethical and really meant, but at the same time, almost without meaning to be, their music can be sending another message, which is actually Britain needs to smarten up and become more businesslike. And that sort of feeling of being on the cusp between these two worlds, that totally fascinated me. And Simon brings out in his book, and I kind of explored it a bit more. And it's not to be finger pointing and saying, you're all hypocrites, you know, or anything like that. It's more subtle than that.
Yeah. I mean, significantly, I think a lot of it was simply a response to what had immediately preceded it. I remember going down the Acklam Hall and seeing the Raincoats and Prague and so on and so forth, and everyone, you know, miserable. Everyone had a cold. 1979. It was just horrible. And then Scritti Politti produced Sweetest Girl, you know, and I'd seen Scritti Politti at the Acklam Hall, and it was a pretty dismal, endurance test. And suddenly, this just most fabulously beautiful thing comes out, and we all knew who they were politically, so there was no question about that. But suddenly, beauty was allowed back in.
I think that's exactly right, that these changes are, you know, they're not necessarily conscious.
No.
You know, I get that. But I also think that this gets us into something about politics and music, which I think is really important, which is a kind of, there can be an overt politics in music, like, you know, which causes do you support, what do the lyrics say, what are your kind of ethics and how you deal with, you know, people who buy your records or whatever.
How do you vote?
How do you vote? But I think there can also be an unconscious politics, which is like the sound, your general kind of affect, you know, what signal is that sending? What's the racial makeup of the band? What's the gender makeup of the band? And
what
I
are the
think
crowds like at your gigs? You know, how do people behave when they when they feel an affinity towards what you represent? I think that can be a bit looser.
Exactly.
I think there's an interesting conflict in what you were just saying before that, which is that the kind of the heart of it is how can you justify wanting to be successful and commercial while also making political statements, and how do those two things mesh in a capitalist way?
And that's a huge tension, obviously, for anyone who's involved in kind of cultural production is, you know, exactly what happens when that commerce becomes more important. And obviously a lot of those post-punk bands, I would say, broke up quite quickly because they couldn't process that kind of question. But I also think that there is something, you know, pop music is very complex kind of form, and so it can be political on a lot of different levels, and they're not necessarily all meant, and sometimes they can be read different ways. You know, you could read certain kinds of music and say, well, that's a rather right-wing kind of sound on some level, but to someone else it might sound different. So these meanings aren't even that fixed.
Or you can hear the claims of the artist. I mean, U2 have been an example where Bono has always claimed to be on the kind of the right side, and it turns out that some of his favourite gurus are some of the most extreme Newmarket sort of neoliberal, you know. So you know, what game are you playing here?
Or like, you know, I mean, I remember when I was at school, a friend of mine really liked Springsteen and was always playing in the Born in the USA. And you know, I didn't realise till I was about 18, like years afterwards, that was meant to be kind of the anti-Vietnam War, kind of anti-status quo, because I just heard that kind of big drum sound and the sort of glossy, and I just thought this is, and obviously a lot of people who like Springsteen still like that song in a kind of, in inverted commas, right-wing sense to this day.
If you just sing the chorus. And don't bother listening with the rest.
Well, I think Trump definitely played it at some of his early rallies, didn't he?
Until
Springsteen.
But I
I think
remember
managed to put a stop to it.
When Springsteen toured here in '83, he the miners' strike, he was donating, gate money to the miners.
So it is complex. I think you're absolutely right. I wanted to actually touch on Red Wedge and specifically Everything But the Girl, who have a new album out this month, because I think that was a really interesting moment where you had these pretty commercial pop acts forming this kind of alliance. And we've got a piece by William Shaw from Smash Hits, which is a sort of report on the Red Wedge tour. It's an interesting moment. And that's 86.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten how late that was, but it's Paul Weller and the Style Council. It's Spandau Ballet.
Yeah.
It's as well as Billy Bragg, the Smiths were played dates on that tour, which is really, really interesting. So there's the usual suspects, but Gary Kemp himself says in this piece, people don't think of us as political, but I grew up in a Labour household. And I sort of wanted to touch on really interesting things you're saying about affect and about what production can say, that you can be ostensibly political, but or left wing, but your records sound very, very commercial and sort of bombastic. And so the long read that we're running on the homepage is this 1984 interview with Everything But the Girl, and they're really interesting because they're talking about not playing Top of the Pops because of the sort of semi-naked girls, and they just won't do it. They say, we'd rather people come and see us live. We're not going to play Top of the Pops. I really admire the fact that they've really stuck to their guns. They never did sort of make a record with Trevor Horn.
Yeah.
And I think they've had a really fascinating career, but they were derided back then as being these sort of po-faced students.
They were I mean, I said that my friend Sean O'Hagan from my Uncrem set had Ben jeering at his Paisley Telecaster as being an unhip article because it was Paisley, and a real guitar was a semi-acoustic. So there was something distinctly po-faced about them back then. Yeah,
but it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because in a way, Ben Watt and Tracey Thorn were like they're like the godparents of woke, and it's the same refrain all these years later that anyone who talks about right on in any way, politically correct, is immediately lambasted as being humourless and po-faced and joyless. And we're in that moment, aren't we? We've got these sort of Tory comedians who just can't stand anyone saying anything about racism or misogyny.
Absolutely. We're in a period, I would argue we're in a period of kind of quite intense identity politics where it's kind of resurgent, but there's also a very strong reaction against it. And it's quite like what happened in the 80s, with the inverted commas loony left councils, where they were doing all kinds of things, some of which actually were kind of made up by the tabloids, but they were doing plenty of things which I think most people now who are remotely left of centre might think are pretty good, like, hiring more women or thinking about racial bias or whatever. But there's this accusation of, you're all terribly earnest. And in the interview you mentioned with Everything But the Girl, I mean, the fierceness with which they hold on to their positions as the interviewer is kind of goading them and sort of saying, oh, come on, about, and they just absolutely rigidly stick to what. And in some ways that's kind of maddening to read, but in some ways it's kind of heroic because they're just like, nope, we're not doing this. That's it. And I guess when that interview is it 84?
84, yeah.
So maybe by that point, I mean, that's obviously Rock Against Racism has kind of faded.
Yes.
So maybe there's a sort of little bit of a kind of music press thing going on about, that was 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Now we're going to slightly, mock this.
Well, I mean, there are two parallels between. Well, there's another parallel between then and now. Is you could argue that after the disastrous Michael Foot 1983 election campaign, and Neil Kinnock's rebuilding the party, which eventually led to Tony Blair, is not dissimilar to what's happening in the Labour Party now.
Yeah,
correct.
I mean, I think we'll just hope that next election is 97 rather than 92. But but there is that as well. And yes, then it was loony left, and now it's woke and so on and so forth. But, and again, to some extent, it's an age division as well. We are returning to a sort of separation of the ages in a way that we haven't seen since the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really, really extreme. I mean, without being too much of a political nerd about this, if you look at the 2010 election when the Conservatives got back into power, in that election amongst pensioners, Labour and the Conservatives were almost neck and neck. The Conservatives won by a few percent.
Right.
And at the last election, the Conservatives won amongst pensioners by about 40%.
Wow.
And so there's been generally older people are a bit more conservative, but it's not it's not written in stone. That
No,
there's
well, someone who's been taking their pension for the last 2 years.
Yeah. but it's a startling.
You voted Tory in the last.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We can finally admit it.
Yeah.
But it's true,
it's a really good point you make though. That in a way, there's a kind of there's a generational battle that is maybe more like from the 50s or the 60s or something.
Yeah.
Like this. Whereas for a lot of my early adulthood in the sort of 90s and the noughties, that gap was much more blurred,
right?
And it's kind of returned.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been that myth that we're heading towards a great future because young people are fantastic and right on, and yet we've had some of the most reactionary governments here and in America that we can remember. But now people are saying, well, actually, this is starting to change. That the current people in their 50s and 60s are more likely to keep their left-wing politics than previous generations would have. Partly because they see what's happened to their children in terms of not being able to buy houses, not being able to, earn decent money and live in a city like London. I have, in my kind of younger age group of friends, a mass exodus from London, which would have been unimaginable in our youths.
And I think while it is true that there is this generational difference, I think that can sometimes obfuscate why that generational difference exists.
Yes.
And that, describing it as a generational thing leads people to think that it's about older people getting more conservative as they age, and rather than thinking about the material circumstances that young people are in that are making them feel certain ways, like not being able to afford houses, not being able to afford to live in cities, and not being able to find work that permits that kind of thing without doing something hyper commercial.
Obviously, the invention of the internet has changed everything hugely, and the media landscape's changed. Is that governments still seem terrified of newspapers who are selling fewer and fewer copies, which I still don't quite understand as why currently the Tory party's dog is being wagged by the Telegraph's tail.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose my explanation for that would be that amongst the voters that Labour and the Conservatives are particularly obsessed by getting, who are generally older people living in what's called the Red Wall, if that thing exists, those people still read a lot of newspapers. And so that's partly what's going on. And also, I would argue that things like the BBC are over-influenced by what's on the front of the Daily Mail. So it has a kind of, it's amplified in that way. But no, it is kind of startling when I try and explain to my kids who are 18 and 20 that newspapers matter politically. They sort of just look at me like, what are you talking about?
I know.
So I agree, it is strange, but I mean, I'm always slightly too optimistic, but my argument as someone who's sort of left of centre would be that, yes, we're always waiting for the great moment where young people kind of run the world. But I think perhaps it is a bit different now because, as you've said, maybe people in middle age have had a different formation. They've come up through, a more, in some ways more liberal, more pop culture dominated world. And there's an interesting argument made that pensioners now are beneficiaries of Thatcherism, a lot of them. They bought their houses under right to buy and so on, so they're a particularly right-wing cohort, and it's an unusually right-wing. So that effect may then change.
Right.
Soon the people in the 60s were people who didn't buy their council house because they couldn't afford to, or because
have been renting all their lives.
Exactly. So I think probably change is coming in that way. And I'd argue that in a lot of countries, like in Britain and America, a lot of people on the right are doing quite clever things with, constituency boundaries. We might call this gerrymandering or voter ID, because they realise we need to really maximise our dwindling, large but dwindling kind of grumpy old man vote, essentially, that we need, that has to have maximum leverage. And this is the way to do it. And that can be very smart politics, but it's, unless you get very extreme, it's quite hard to make that work in the long term.
No, I mean, the obvious thing which is different from that is America, simply because of the way the American political system is set up. We could be looking at a future of electorally minority Republican administrations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, arguably, that's all. The Republicans have somewhere like Texas is fascinating. That Texas, by most counts, is a majority Democratic state in terms of who lives there, and yet the Republicans control every level of government. Yeah. And they do all. I remember I went to Austin once years ago, and obviously Austin, relatively liberal,
very liberal system,
but they've gerrymandered it so that every single bit of Austin is like a kind of the pointy bit of a slice of pizza. There's a huge rural hinterland for each. So even in Austin, I think a lot of the elected positions are held by Republicans because they just incorporate these country areas into the same. Yes. So You're right. In America, it is a bit different.
And
but
you have a system where you have 2 senators from every state.
Exactly.
So a state which has a population of 200,000-300,000 has the same number of senators as California or New York.
Yeah, sure.
Can we briefly go back to 1981?
I think that's always a good...
and slightly more parochially.
Sorry.
No worries. We quite enjoy it when someone phones in to the podcast.
Yeah, it's Keir Starmer's just ringing to say, you need to talk about orange juice.
Yeah, fantastic. But I thought it'd be a good moment to just talk about the week's audio and hear a couple of clips from that. So, Mark.
Yeah, it's The Beat's been interviewed by John Tobler in 1981. David Steele and Ranking Roger, the one who failed to go on and succeed afterwards, and the unlikely one who did massively well afterwards with Fine Young Cannibals. And, well, we'll listen to the first clip. They're talking about political involvement and... Unemployment, that's right.
Stand down, Margaret, stand down, please stand down, Margaret. You tell me how can it work in this all-white law? What's a short, sharp lesson, what's a third world war?
It might not be particularly fashionable at the moment to talk about unemployment or whatever, but it's getting worse and worse. And it's just like our way of saying, yes, we can see it. I don't think it's going to change much.
You seem to be a band that gets involved in causes. Like
No, we get involved in the world outside. And seeing England's in such a state at the moment, you have to get involved in things like that.
I mean, like, unemployment and, like, I don't know, like, nuclear power is where we've done benefits for both of them. And it's like... just thinking, like, it's your life that's being messed around with, that's why we've done it. And for unemployment, what happens, like, in 10 years' time when probably I won't be able to find a job? Gotta fight for that. It's everybody's future.
Oh, stand down, Margaret, stand down, please stand down, Margaret. I say stand down, Margaret, stand down, please stand down, Margaret.
We must mention the fact that in the last podcast episode with Rob Dickens, there's this splendid story about when Madonna first came to London, and she didn't turn up for her first interviews the next day because, to quote Mr. Dickens, he said, "What word shall I use? She had been partying with Ranking Roger." 2 years after this. So
they go on to talk about changing producers. Malu Halassa's book on the band. Malu Halassa is a writer I'd like to get hold of for Rockspec Pages very much, if that's at all possible. Anyone out there know of her whereabouts? Put her in touch. About their Go Feet label, about working with the Congo's Cedric Myton. The Congo's been absolutely one of my favourite bands, and so that is very interesting. Sax are their wonderful old. In fact, it wasn't that old. He's only in his 50s.
Probably younger than us.
It wasn't significantly younger than me. He was taking a back seat, and his son Lionel taking over, doing cover versions, their new single hit it. But we'll listen to the next clip. It's about their opposition to nuclear weapons.
Now, you've expressed a lot of interest in the past in the anti-nuclear business, and you've done benefits and stuff, and Stand Down Margaret's proceeds were given to the anti-nuclear, whatever it is. What's the story? Are you still going to carry on with that?
Yeah, well, you have to, really, unless we all want to get blown up pretty quick. I mean, we just come back from America, and the feeling there is so weird. I mean, everybody in Washington was totally out of their brains. I mean, I don't know if you know the story about Washington, is that everybody goes out of their brains on cocaine. I mean, I'm not particularly into that sort of thing at all, but that's what all the generals and... Anyway, maybe we shouldn't talk about that anyway, but the anti-nuclear campaign, it's very important to us, because unless something happens pretty quickly...
I mean, you just imagine millions of people in Britain, and just to think, if we carry on having missiles in England, which are controlled from America, that means your life is being handled by a maniac who's got control over a red button. You know what I mean? And that's from the other side of the world.
It's very frightening, though, because we could die in the next 3 years. Like, all we're trying to do is get a few facts over to people.
It's a most compulsive family entertainment, everybody. Everybody's in the bunker, everybody's getting pushy. Beat the others round the head, beat the others to the button. Feel your habit of obedience, but surely count for something.
I mean, you know, we can laugh at their sort of reasonably naive approaches, but I mean, I remember vividly when the cruise missiles started arriving at Greenland Common and so on and so forth, and the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan was, who'd only just been elected. 81 was
who won in 1980, but become president exactly in 81. Yes,
and the rhetoric that he was using, and that Margaret Thatcher was happily joining in with, was really unnerving. I was living in a council flat in Bowen, 14th floor, and I used to have nightmares of mushroom clouds rising over what would have been Rumford, you know, being my view. So, you know, if it gets into your head to the point where you actually have nightmares about nuclear war, it just shows how one felt it, sort of.
No, it was a scary time. I mean, my dad was in the army, and we were living in Germany then, and quite near the border. And, you know, they used to test, you know, various sirens on the base where he was and stuff. And, you know, I can remember as like an 11-year-old, it would go off and you think, is that a test? Yeah, seriously. It was that. Yes. And there was all this stuff up on the posters, I remember, in the building where he worked, where, like, you know, Russian tanks could be here in 2 hours or whatever, you know. And
very real.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And I think, obviously, a lot of musicians, I mean, you know, all sorts. I mean, sort of Kate Bush and This Heat and all kinds of people, all kinds of musics were very preoccupied at this time, UB40, with the possibility of nuclear war.
Yeah. Yes.
And that was a massive politicising thing, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, again, another parallel with now, the Ukraine invasion. Yeah. And suddenly, the absolute possibility that via the low use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield could expand into a proper nuclear conflict. I didn't think we'd ever be back here again. I thought those, you know, when the Berlin Wall came down, you know, 89 and so on and so forth, I thought that those days were over. Well, you know, they ain't.
Yeah. I mean, just to put the interview in context, you know, because we were talking earlier about the early 80s period, and although the Beat were not on two-tone, they were from the Midlands.
Yeah. Their first single was two-tone, I think?
That's probably right. I can't
remember.
I think that was Madness. It was Madness, sorry, yeah. But they came out of the same scene and were involved in the same politics and benefits and stuff like that. Actually, it saddens me that people don't talk about the Beat in the way that they talk about the Specials anymore. I mean, I'm not saying that they ever made a record as great as Ghost Town, but they were quite a exciting outfit.
I love it. I bought Hands Off She's Mine and then the first album, and I sort of rapidly went off them. First of all, I hated Stand Down Margaret because the sort of didactic, over-direct political lyrics just don't work for me. And they never really wrote the good enough songs, actually, you know.
No, and people don't really talk much about them anymore.
No, it's interesting. Yeah, you're right. They're not so much part of the story, are they? No. Going back to Ghost Town, though, I think that is the video for Ghost Town, that kind of famous video. I think that's a really interesting example of inadvertent politics in a video, because clearly the song is about kind of social decay and tension, and it's a melancholy video, and they're driving through London, and they go past at one point the NatWest Tower, which had been built in the late 70s, and one thing I think is fascinating is, almost without knowing it, or perhaps exactly without knowing it, they're driving through the very place which very soon is going to become the centre of Thatcherism and her takeover. So the song's meant to be about, you know, Britain in decline, etc., a melancholy, and actually it's showing you these big city edifices, admittedly in kind of moody black and white, but essentially they're missing the story. It's like the story's right in front of them, they're driving past it in the car. That is the place that is going to replace your version of, and, you know, that's not to do the song or the video down at all, but I think you can even see that moment is even in that video.
I mean, though I will say kind of against that is that at the time when that record came out, we all absolutely knew what it was about, and that it really. I mean, it was the year of the riots in Brixton and so on and so forth, and it absolutely captured.
Oh no, I understand. It's one of the great political records.
But there is an irony.
There is an irony. Yes. But in the video, it's like they're just driving past the place. You know, that literally, 3 or 4 years after this song comes out, people in that building are going to be remaking Britain in a way that
doing all the cocaine that Ranking Rogers is talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah, exactly.
Though it's also an extraordinary piece of music, Ghost Town.
Oh, it is.
You listen to it today, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, it is.
This storm is coming like a ghost town. All the clouds
there's so many things that we could talk about in this theme. So many extraordinary political moments. Obviously, we could do like 3 or 4 hours on the history of politics of pop, and we're not going to do that. I wanted just to mention the feature on the RBP homepage tries to sort of stretch from kind of the early 60s folk activism through to, there's a great piece that Lisa Verico wrote in 2016 called Where Are the Political Pop Stars? So, and in between those two poles, there's everything from sort of, the MC5 to Mick Farron to the Dead Kennedys to Sun City, Steve Van Zandt. There's lots of kind of nodes along the way. So we've added this Peter, Paul and Mary piece that Maureen Cleave did in 1963, where they're talking about, that they want their message to cut through, even though their albums are selling lots and lots of copies. Their main concern is that their social and moral messages are penetrating and cutting through. I just wanted to mention what sort of got me thinking about this partly was that I've just started reading this book by an American writer called Jeff Charlotte, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, called The Undertow, which is basically about the rise of American fascism. One of the things that's interesting about it from our point of view is that it's bookended by these two really interesting, beautifully written chapters, quite kind of Greil Marcus-y type chapters. The first one is about Harry Belafonte. Right. And the last one is about the Weavers, and specifically Lee Mays. But it just, in both of these, I mean, I found it shocking to read them, and I mean, I'm ignorant of just how brave
we didn't
both the Belafonte and the Weavers
We
were.
didn't have the blacklist here.
Yes.
No, and that really defined certain sections of the American left. The American right too.
And there's a shocking story of Belafonte and Sidney Poitier flying into Mississippi at the time of the civil rights when the 3 activists were murdered, and how they're chased by the Klan and through the night. I mean, it's just like...
But in Washington, people like Pete Seeger have been blacklisted. Simply for possible association with communists and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's one thing that we didn't have in this country. We didn't have that massive abiding fear of communism. We had a lot of Labour MPs who, for all intents and purposes, were communists. There were Labour MPs after the Second World War. 2 or 3 communist MPs. The party was never banned in this country. But in America, it was a very, very different story, basically.
Work all night and a drink a rum. Daylight come and we want go home. Stack banana till the morning come. Daylight come.
And then to sort of, bring it up to mention this Lisa Verico piece. The subtitle of that is Selfie-Obsessed Stars Are Selling Out to the Power of Branding. I mean, it's all about, it's a piece from December 2016. Trump has won the election. He's not in the White House yet, but he's won the election. Brexit has all this stuff has happened. And what Verico is saying is, where are the voices from musicians? She quotes Crispin Hunt, former frontman of the Long Pigs, and now at this point, chairman of the British Songwriters Association, BASCA. And he says, music at the moment is much more about self-regard and solace than social issues. Pop used to be at the vanguard of political and social activism, but as its primary function became to entertain, it was easier to distance itself from the world outside. And he also uses the phrase, the narcissism of the digital age. So,
true or false?
True. I mean, why there are a number of different reasons why major stars are not standing up against the would-be dictators of the modern age in quite the overt way that perhaps they could be.
I suppose partly I'd argue it's because popular culture deals with politics in more diverse ways than it used to, So when there was the whole kind of movement behind Corbyn, one of the big things was a video game, Corbyn Run. That was one of the... So it was almost like, we'll make a game where Corbyn is the heroic main character rather than write a song about how great he is.
And Corbyn at Glastonbury and Jeremy Corbyn and so on.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. It is puzzling, though, really, because I'd argue we're in a really quite politicised time, unlike... 10 years ago, for good and bad ways we are, and politics is something I think people are more interested in than they were, especially younger people who you would think are a big group of consumers for kind of pop music. And, you know, you sort of think overtly political British bands, I mean, sort of Sleaford Mods or something, you know, even, you know, and they've been around for quite a while, haven't they?
Yeah.
I think there's kind of a difference between political, as in, you know, party politics and
or statement
Westminster,
making,
or political. I mean, you know, you could say lowercase p political or uppercase p political. How you want to sort of differentiate those two things?
Sure.
It's like the business of politics, I think, can still be seen as something that's a bit poisonous to get involved with because it's seen as detached. You know, it's not actually authentic to be sort of saying, "Oh, vote Labour" or something.
Can I also make another parallel with the 60s, maybe?
Feel about politics.
That actually, that we also live in a time of wellness and all of this sort of stuff. And so we've, in a way, become more inward-looking in a similar way to the way the hippies were quite inward-looking in that respect. And in the same way as that pop rejected politics in the late 60s, maybe that sort of side of the culture is doing the same thing again, whilst at the same time all this other shit's going on. You know, the Black Lives Matter and the really important things, you know.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, on the other hand, I'd say maybe in ways that are less direct, pop music still has been quite political in Britain the last 10 years. I mean, you think of kind of grime or the rise of kind of British hip-hop, and I know there's a kind of blurred distinction. I think, you know, and I'm saying this obviously as a white person, but I think that has said something quite important about black identity in Britain and has made black people more visible.
Yes.
And I think that is a kind of profound political kind of change. And it might not be yet manifested in Westminster because a lot of black voters are in safe Labour seats, and so arguably in our electoral system they don't have that much clout. But I think the visibility, you know, when I was into hip-hop, you know, as a much younger person in the 80s and 90s, the idea that there'd be lots of British rappers and that there'd be lots of those people who American rappers would want on their records would have seemed totally far-fetched.
Yeah.
And then I remember when Tricky started, I was really into him in the sort of early 90s and Massive Attack and that whole thing. And that seemed like quite an important moment. And obviously grime and everything around it is that, but on a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not necessarily that the black artists are saying we stand up for particular causes, but although obviously some grime artists did get behind Corbyn and that was probably quite significant. But I think that's kind of an example of almost like an indirect politics being important.
Question for the new Prime Minister. How do you have a heart so sinister? How are you so wasteful when people are dying in Somalia, Afghanistan, Egypt, Libya? The irony is we have no business in Syria. But kids.
And another thing which relates to that, we're talking about rough trade and the importance of labels like rough trade. The grime was effectively a DIY homemade thing. And yes, the major artists have gone onto major labels and selling large amounts of, but it's a homegrown scene, very much in the way that the DIY post-punk scene was.
Yeah.
And I think the type of overt political statement has changed as well. You know, I mean, people now, discourse, if you want to put it that way, has kind of fractured in such a way that when, you know, rather than making broader statements, artists will pick a specific cause. I mean, we were talking about this before we started recording, but, you know, for example, Lizzo's body positive activism, for example, is something that is very specific to one cause. And I think that social media and the way that pop culture works these days does perhaps lend itself more towards, you know, pursuing specific things rather than making broad statements that can feel, I think, a bit alienating, a bit kind of
Well, that's all very
unreal.
But you know, what if democracy does die in America, for example, and none of the giant figures of American popular music of the last 20 years said anything about it?
But I mean, they do. I mean, they do say things about Trump, for example.
Name me one like anthemic song that addresses Trump and fascism.
There's a real problem here because of the way in which music is sold in America. It's really easy to shut people up. I mean, the Dixie Chicks really came up with some radical stuff, and their careers just absolutely nosedive. They didn't get played. They were no longer played on country radio
now, by the way.
But yes, I know, but they're no longer played on radio. They you know, that sort of stuff. You can be shut down in America in that sort of way.
And I think people, I mean, you're asking for anthemic songs that say these things. I think people say them, you know, in Instagram stories or on TikTok.
Well, that's the other thing,
It's artists have access to the public in a way that doesn't require that access to be via music in the way that it used to be.
I mean, I understand. I'm probably nostalgic for a time when records like Shipbuilding, Free Nelson Mandela, Ghost, etc.
Yeah.
They really spoke for us, I suppose, in a way, and maybe that nostalgia is misplaced.
Well, no, but see, again, you're talking about a much more limited landscape.
Exactly.
You know, now the landscape is as wide and
It's
as
fractured
deep as
and,
you know. So I don't think anything can ever have that sort of power.
No.
I mean, Kendrick Lamar is making extremely political records and saying, even in his lyrics, very political things. Just as one example, but again, you know, I think the terms of the engagement have kind of changed in a funny sort of way.
I agree.
This piece, Lisa, she makes a very good point, and this is now 6 years ago, over 6 years ago. She talks about Taylor Swift keeping stum about her feelings one way or other about Trump. You know, she can't afford to, because broadly speaking, half her audience was Republican and half was red and half was blue. She couldn't afford to alienate 50% of her fans. But there's a I mean, in a sense, what you've said has answered this point. She quotes Amanda Ghost in this article, who had been a musician and was at this point an executive, and she says she sees a brighter future for 2017. I honestly think Trump could be pop's saviour. The prospect of President Trump is horrifying, but it reminds me of the Thatcher and Reagan years and how fantastic pop became in their wake. Trump will give artists something real to rally against. We've sort of addressed that.
Yes, and I sort of think it is barking up the wrong tree, because the tree it's a different tree we're living under now. You know.
Yeah.
But I think the point about the divided audience is right. Barney's point that you know, it's when things are so polarised, because we know that in the early 80s, lots of lefty British musicians were putting out records that were being bought by people who didn't agree with their politics. You know, people would be like, "Oh, well, I just like two-tone anyway."
Yes.
And so it wasn't quite such a
the two-tone skinhead audience. You know?
Well, exactly. Yeah,
of course. I mean, in that Red Wedge piece, they talked to various audience members afterwards, and poignantly, there's one fan who said, "Well, I just came along for the bands, and the only thing that changed my mind at all was the Smiths. I hadn't liked them particularly, but I like them much better having seen them on playing a Red Wedge."
And you'll like them even more now.
I know. It's like, oh my God! I mean, you know, we do not have time to go in the trajectory of Morris's metamorphosis.
No, that's a special program in itself.
The series program, exactly. Anyway, all very, very interesting. I mean, we are talking at the end of a week in which, you know, Donald Trump was indicted, and also Finland has joined NATO, so it's been quite a week in the political.
But also,
sphere.
where a left-wing leader in Finland was replaced by
that's true.
You know, a
coalition.
What's worth noting about Finland is that incumbent leaders in Finland basically never win elections, so her party's performance actually exceeded expectations for that. So it's not, you know, obviously it's not good that they didn't win, but it's not as bad as it can look.
And she had to take a drugs test because she was filmed dancing.
I know.
Yeah. I want to mention one more thing which did cheer me up this week before we go on to the library highlights was Reba McEntire, who was a sort of pillar of the Nashville establishment in the 80s and 90s, standing up for trans rights in Tennessee, which
good for her. Good for her.
I mean, again, I've said I'm too optimistic, but I do think it's interesting when you see these signs that people in inverted commas conservative, you know, there's subtle changes, and I spend too much time reading right-wing newspapers in the British Library for my own research purposes. And it's fascinating if you look in something like the Telegraph, you know, the front page is all as you'd expect and fierce, you know, probably fiercely right-wing, more so than it was, you know, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
But if you look in the kind of wedding section, it'll be like Organic Wedding in Hackney, you know, and there's a kind of interesting thing where sort of wokery, in a subtle way, is kind of creeping up through the kind of layers of the... And I think that's a fascinating thing as well, the extent to which, in the culture, if you like, broadly defined, people are kind of losing when they think they're winning. You know? And I think that's not to say that liberals are going to win everywhere, because absolutely not. And it can go the other way too. But I think that's an interesting thing that can be happening. That all kinds of stuff which, you know, in the 80s would have been seen as completely insane, you know, by people on the right in Britain, is now standard even in right-wing parties. Like, we need to have an ethnically diverse base of candidates, for example. That would have been seen as a loony left kind of Ken Livingstone idea. Now that's just kind of standard. So there's kind of complexity in how the culture sort of moves politically, and it's never, I would say, it's never moving in one direction at once. It's kind of simultaneously getting more right-wing and left-wing at the same time, depending on who you're talking to and about what.
And also just because there are different forces pulling in different directions.
Yeah.
So there are economic forces, there are social forces, and they are actually, you know, they're diverging. The economic forces
absolutely.
we are now in possibly a new depression or whatever. On the other hand, you have greater freedom of expression and ideas in terms of your sexuality and all kinds of sort of areas like that.
Not in Texas or Florida or Tennessee.
Anyway,
let's end on that optimistic note. We do also need to talk about two major figures that we've lost in the last week, namely Ryuichi Sakamoto and the slightly easier to pronounce Seymour Stein.
Seymour Stein.
Sakamoto, most people will know from either, you know, Yellow Magic Orchestra or Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and Jasper.
Titanic figure in Japanese music. I mean, you know, and that band, Yellow Magic Orchestra, each member of it did really interesting stuff. And it's funny, we were just talking yesterday, we were talking about video games. They were one of the first groups to sort of recognise the idea that video game music could be interesting.
And that was a Radio 3 slot dedicated to video game music, which I think is just kind of marvellous.
I love some Yellow Magic Orchestra stuff. I love some of his solo stuff. I think he just was a fascinating kind of guy. And I think that Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, I think he was quite pissed off by the fact that he was kind of just typecast as a Japanese villain in that.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of appreciation of Japanese music is kind of coloured by a certain typecasting of Japanese people in that way. But you know, there's a lot of stuff there that's well worth diving into.
Yellow Magic Orchestra passed me by at time because it just wasn't an area I was listening to. But so many of my friends whose opinions I respect have been raving about him on his death. I'm going to do some serious revisiting. Regarding Seymour Stein, one of the last of the record men, the old-fashioned record men, and of course, in a way, we had a tribute a month ago from Rob Dickens talking about his introduction to the music business.
Yes,
was courtesy of the man. Really important, you know. Ramones, Madonna, so much kind of interesting stuff.
Absolutely, incredibly important.
And somebody who was a real sort of fan and very eclectic in what he liked. That's really interesting to read about.
I mean, people say you don't get record men like that anymore, and I don't think that's true. There are people who run some of the quasi-independents in London, in England in particular, who I'd categorise as true record men. But there was that point in the 90s when all the labels were being bought up successfully until you basically had three massive combines, Phonogram, and you know, and that killed the classic record man. It became accountants, it became profit-driven, and he was a real record man.
Yeah. Isn't that a very good Bell and Sebastian song, Seymour Stein? Is that by them?
Yes, they did write a song because he signed them to Sire.
I mean, I've obviously, because I don't listen to lyrics properly, I've never really bothered following them. But there's some sense in the song that he's like coming to like listen to them play and then going off on his jet plane again afterwards and everything. And it's very evocative.
Because we had Chris Blackwell on the podcast, and he's a true record man too. And I think there's something I love about these people who kind of senior in a company, but can absolutely determine an aesthetic and an approach to.
And talking of the great record men, I mean, one of the things that happens when we lose major figures like this is that at least one or two of our writers send in things. I wrote this piece, I did this interview with Seymour. We actually got this audio interview sent in by Jason Cohen, where he in turn is talking about another great record man who is the mentor for him, which is Sid Nathan of King Records. So he talks a lot about, you know, he basically moved to Cincinnati from his native New York to work for Sid.
Sid Nathan, no James Brown, no James Brown, no funk. I mean, it's kind of that, isn't it?
And you think of a lot of these people as pretty kind of ruthless and pretty cutthroat, but you listen to the way Seymour talks about Sid Nathan. Yeah. And there is, genuine affection there. So you think this guy can't have been that ruthless.
I mean, maybe the royalties are a bit sketchy, but
but also they have a kind of interesting sort of internal conflict, don't they? Because they're sort of music fans and they're always sort of trading off between what's going to be adventurous and what's going to sell and all those. So those conflicts that are within musicians and within fans are there in them.
And they're white Jews more often than not. Often dealing with black music. Both minorities, both victims of the Ku Klux Klan and so on and so forth.
Yes,
There's all kinds of complications there. But that's another podcast.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and there's a couple of Sakamoto pieces that are on the homepage at the moment. One from Elle magazine, of all things, Mark Derry, asking Sakamoto particularly about Yellow Magic Orchestra, which is interesting, and Jim Sullivan, an interview from 1998 for the Boston Globe. So,
farewell.
Farewell.
Seymour and
both of those men. And at this point, Andy, Mark's going to tell us about some of the pieces he's added to the library. If there's anything that kind of rings a bell, inspires you to say something, please jump in.
Yeah, Hullabaloo 1967, Paul Nelson reviews Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This is what went in last week. And he says, here at last, for enjoyment and edification, we have the first Joycean pop album. Listening to it is like solving a delicious puzzle. You think as you tap your foot. Joycean, the first Joycean pop album. I put that quote on Facebook and we got some fairly interesting responses. He also says, with this album, undoubtedly their masterpiece, the Beatles emerged with Bob Dylan as the major musical forces in the golden age of pop music. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Is that a Freudian slip?
There's a Freudian slip, if ever wasn't. Is that rarity among popular records, a completely realised, relaxed and successful work of art. So that's
shows critics can be totally wrong then, can't they?
Are you Beatles or Stones or
I'm kind of. It's interesting that maybe it's my age, and like I said at the very beginning about stuff not being available, but a lot of 60s music I still don't really, doesn't really in my family, my kids love the Beatles. I still, there's a lot of very famous Beatles songs I've literally never heard.
Right.
But interestingly, with my kids, they know all about the Beatles, and Mick Jagger went into a restaurant when my son was working, and my son didn't know who Mick Jagger was. And I thought it's really interesting. The Rolling Stones, enormous thing, very important, all the rest of it.
Partly because they never went away.
Maybe
they
that's
just
it,
sort
precisely.
of kind of,
Right.
This is really interesting. This is Barry Kane interviewing Joan Armatrading in Record Mirror 1978 in real light of what we've sort of been talking about. Very prickly interview, because she could be very prickly. I mean, she's a really interesting woman. And he keeps on asking her about being black.
Yes.
And she says, don't ask me about contemporary race problems. I refuse to voice an opinion publicly. I may talk about it to friends, but I don't want to see what I think politically in writing. Which I kind of get, because in a way she's been pushed into a corner by the left-wing press. So you should be one of us in this respect, And yet she's writing these intensely personal songs.
Difficult sort of path to tread, isn't it?
Yeah.
The fear of alienating people who might buy your records by being too outspoken. And certainly, that's a long time ago to be in that situation.
Or that becoming the one thing that people know about you. I mean, maybe this is quite famous, but I remember some point in the 80s, the NME did something where they asked all these musicians, who do you vote for? And everybody said, I vote Labour, except for Gary Newman, who said, I vote Tory.
Yes.
And it was like, a sort of excruciating and probably career-damaging thing for him to say. Yeah. And although I, at that point, I think my politics were quite unformed, but I don't think I was a Tory. But even so, I kind of thought this is a bit unhealthy on some level, that he's, that Gary Newman and those amazing sort of songs from that period in the early 80s were sort of suddenly coloured with the fact, he's a Tory.
Yeah, right.
And now we've learned a lot more about Gary Newman, the fact he's autistic and so on and so forth. Just sort of again changes that landscape.
So although part of me was kind of pleased that they were all Labour supporters, but part of me thought there's something a bit queasy about this, that it's this like blanket position that you have to hold.
Sure. Yeah.
This week, Jimmy Page. Well, we've got two. We've got Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page separately interviewed, which is sort of two ends of the same
Beck,
shelf, you know.
Brexiteer.
Was he?
He was.
Oh, God, it's dismal, isn't it?
All those sorry green belt rock squillionaires were voted leave.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Daltrey.
I've got to be. A long time ago, I posted a quote where Paul McCartney was saying the worst thing, we shouldn't go into Europe because it means we'll lose feet and inches and miles, and we'll have to drive in kilometres. And it's just like, get a grip, man.
And we haven't.
You won't be able to get PG tips anymore.
Exactly. We've still got them. Yeah.
So this is him talking about Led Zeppelin 4. It says it's not going to be called anything. It's a non-entity in the marketplace. Non-entity in the market?
Non-entity.
Non-entity. Well, it was printed as non-entity. It's not going to have a title. There's 4 runes or symbols on it. Each of us has picked one. And then he says, but the fact is there were so many foul-ups by engineers, basically engineers. Andy Johns deserves to be hung, drawn and quartered for the fiascos he played. Well,
so
but
mild slapping of the wrist.
Well, yeah, but remember, this is the Andy Johns who had sailed too close to Keith Richards, and I posted that on Facebook. I forget which album's been produced. They said he was falling asleep at the mixing desk. He was nodding out.
Well, they fucked up. They tried to mix When the Levee Breaks at Sunset Sound, and it came back to London and put it on, and it just sounded awful.
Well,
they were all sitting there going, "What the fuck have you done to this?" Epic,
but
blues metal song.
We mixed a bunch of stuff at Sunset Sound with Susan Rogers, and we brought it back to London and sounded shit too. Yes,
something happens on the flight back.
Something happens on the flight back. Let me see what else have we got here. Any fascinating? Oh, this is great. Talking Heads. Tina Weymouth and to Chris Heath. Smash Hits 1985. First, she says, "I love Madonna. I'm all for her. I just love the joy in her voice. I think she's got a lot of balls and she's very funny. I love to read her interviews. I love crucifixes because there's a naked man on them. I think that's wonderful. Here's a girl, just like Prince, who lost her mother young and she's got a daddy fixation." And then she goes to say, he, David Byrne, has been indulged. That happens to a lot of creative people. They've been indulged as children by their parents and are allowed to get away with murder. He knows it. I love Talking Heads interviews from that period because she's so rude about David Byrne all the time.
Well, I mean, I did this interview with them in '83 in Maryland, I think it was. They played a show. It was like some of this. It ended up in the Stop Making Sense film. And I interviewed Byrne, who was really very difficult man to interview. And I then went to the other changing room where Chris and Tina were sitting. And they were like, "So, how was David?" And it was like, and I sort of said, whatever he had, some of the things he'd said to me, and they were like looking at each other, rolling their eyes.
She never really forgave him for making her re-audition for the band when they got signed.
Right.
Which is a pretty.
It was a very, very divided camp.
Yeah.
I mean, the shows were extraordinary. But
so that whole thing about when they first started and how they dressed in that kind of preppy way, particularly him. It's interesting. I mean, I didn't know any of this stuff. That sense that he actually was pretty conventional, and sort of patriarchal and all the rest of it. It wasn't just like a kind of art look. He actually who he was.
I mean, and we talked about Gary Newman, but I always felt Byrne is somewhere on the spectrum.
Somewhere on the spectrum, I think. I mean, it was one of those I did love about Talking Heads. And I loved that first album so much, and they looked so different that I was like, wow, what does this mean? What is this about?
Yeah, I liked them, and I fell in love with them around Remain in Light, and I just thought they were just fantastic band. Lastly, Sun Ra, Gene Santoro, the late great Gene Santoro, for Pulse 1987. This is Sun Ra in just full flow. "The creators use me because people are ready for something better. I do what the creator tells me. I'm not a man, I'm really an angel. I'm not a minister, a preacher, or a politician. There is no classification for what I'm here to do." And he goes on to say, "Sun Ra is the only name that can help planet Earth. Now that words have gone bad from the Tower of Babel, I don't want anyone to worship me or my people. I just want to get this planet back on its feet."
Fabulous.
Did you ever see the orchestra at Cafe Otto?
I've got a neighbour who I go to a lot of music at Otto with, and he loves the orchestra and is always trying to get me to go.
Yeah.
And the only time I've seen them, I think I decided at the last minute, actually, I am going to go. And I got there, and it's sold out already. You could basically stand by the door, and the door kept swinging open. And so I had about half an hour's worth, just like standing in the doorway. And although I've become more of a jazz fan, I liked it, but I wasn't quite as mesmerised as he was.
So you haven't gone from Miles and Coltrane. You haven't gone into the
planetary
cosmic.
space.
Yeah.
But I saw,
Not yet.
Yeah,
Not give me
on the
time.
spaceship.
it may have been that show. I saw the post Sun Ra Orchestra Cafe show, and they'd come from the end of a long European tour, and half of them about 80 years old, and they were tired, and it really didn't light up at all. But I'm very fond of Sun Ra. I think he's...
Remind me of his the name on his birth certificate that we were.
Oh God, it's Blount.
Herman
Blount.
Herman Blount. I think. But I think it might be pronounced Blunt in America.
Okay.
I think it's just the spelling of Blunt. So Herman Blount Jr. So it's a great name, isn't it?
So that's the beginning of his desire for transformation was there.
I know. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Space is the place. Space is the place. Space is the place. Yeah, space is the place. Outer space.
Anyway, that's my lot. But what about you guys? You got anything?
So I was going to mention, first of all, an Ian Winwood live review of Queens of the Stone Age at the Mean Fiddler in London, partly because the three of us certainly are all big Quatsa fans. And it's a great review in Kerrang in July 2002. Queens of the Stone Age know what they're up against, and they can only do all they can do. There's a skit on Songs from the Deaf that takes the form of an announcement by a slick-voiced, entirely typical American FM radio disc jockey. KRDL 109, he says, "Curdle, we spoil music for everyone." And this is very true. There are so many forces at work that are busy spoiling, souring and corrupting music for everyone. I thought it was kind of interesting in terms of what we're talking about. The sense that nothing is validated without a sponsor attached, a capitalist organisation looking for its aspirational demographic. The Warped Tour is sponsored by Vans. The Osbournes is brought to you by, Christ, knickknacks. The sense that bands are making increasing numbers of allowances with video, with celebrity, with the fusion of music and marketing. And these evils are becoming more and more necessary, blurring the line between integrity and opportunity to the point where it seems as if only a relic would protest. They are making allowances, as are we, the listeners. The beauty of Queens of the Stone Age is that there are no allowances to be made by either party. Within the heart of this beautiful, vibrant music is a sense that every day is anything can happen day. It might end in a mansion, it might end in a skip. It doesn't really matter. And the fact that they don't care means that you can. There is nothing they can say that can't be sung. And I think it's a great review of a great band, and it sort of gets to the heart of how things might have shifted, sort of commercially speaking, in the early 2000s to this, like, everything now is replete with advertising, replete with commercialism. And I you know, Queens of the Stone Age are, in that sense, quite an old-fashioned sort of, like, straight-ahead rock group, and they sound fantastic as well, which helps.
And also something we haven't really talked about, which is just the expense of kind of live music. And, you know, and I understand there's all kinds of reasons why that's happened to do with the economic model kind of breaking down, but that's in a way political, isn't it? Because that's excluding, you know, I'm like a sort of middle-class guy who writes for The Guardian, but a lot of gigs I think I'm not paying 50 quid, 80 quid or whatever, because it kind of really... And Henry Rollins was talking... And I thought with my SST obsession, you know, I've never seen him do a spoken word thing. And, you know, I looked up and it was kind of 50 quid. And I was thinking, you know, and just, it made me think, well, am I going to go? You know, and then even if you do go, it changes the texture of the experience a bit because it's become a kind of boutique edition kind of event.
Yes.
Right now there's extraordinary row about Bruce Springsteen and Ticketmaster.
That's right.
And Robert Smith of The Cure has weighed in big time, hasn't he? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that Bruce Springsteen, Mr. Right On back in the 80s, it seems pretty and given he's just sold his songwriting catalogue, hasn't he, for millions to one of these companies that are buying up catalogues? And he doesn't need to earn another penny in his life. Why is he screwing his fans?
And is he doing that whole sort of dynamic pricing thing? Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is,
very dodgy.
I think it is
scandalous, to be honest.
I think so. I think so. And it does, you know, it does make me think, if you're sort of 20 and you're getting into music and you're not particularly wealthy, i.e. most 20-year-olds, then what the hell are you going to do to go and see live music? Because it's going to be like once a year experience, isn't it? If it's 60 quid.
Or you go to festivals, where you see a whole raft of acts over 2 or 3 days.
I mean, even those are very expensive.
That's a lot. Yeah, exactly.
I would love to have seen Queens at the Mean Fiddler. I only ever saw them once. No, I saw them twice.
Your hearing wouldn't have recovered.
No, well, it hasn't recovered from many gigs before that. I saw them at Ozfest and I saw them at the Hollywood Bowl, and I think Mean Fiddler would have been better. I love that We Spoil Music for Everyone, which is on.
Yeah, it's on
that's
that
on
album.
Songs for the Deaf, which I think is the
So
best
funny.
hard rock album of the last 25 years. Are you a Queen's fan at all?
I've
Do you know?
kind of bits and pieces. I've never bought anything by them. I've heard bits and pieces that I've liked. I'm always quite intrigued by what he looks like, what Josh Homme looks like. There, he kind of looks like
huge,
he's big,
sort of
very
jock
tall,
guy
but
in a
also
lumberjack
like
shirt.
particular kind of haircut that he has and everything.
I think he's utterly brilliant, I must say, and also I think given your love of SST, there's no doubt that as a sort of quote unquote metal band, they were very influenced by Black Flag and Minor Threat and bands like that.
you can see that.
I'm very fond of what I call desert metal, which is Chaos, which is where they came out of.
The band before.
Yeah,
fantastic.
and I love that sludgy noise because it reminds me of Blue Cheer and bands like that. So I had a certain grim fondness.
There's a nod to Blue Cheer, isn't there? There is.
KRDL, Curdle 109. We spoil music for everyone. Shut up, you little brat.
Oh, KRDL, the Curdle.
Jasper, is there
there's one more piece, which is Edwin Pouncey, who was that masked man in The Wire in June 2015, and he's talking about the way that dancehall and reggae kind of started taking inspiration from spaghetti westerns. It's just a fun little piece. The Lone Ranger, Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef ride again as dancehall DJs. The Jamaican obsession with celluloid gunfighters dates back to the rise of reggae in the late 1960s, particularly Lee Scratch Perry's work with the Upsetters. With Perry as producer and arranger, the Upsetters recorded a series of raw, organ-dominated instrumentals, including their version of Chris Kenner's Sick and Tired hit, which Perry retitled Return of Django, reference to Franco Nero's character in Sergio Corbucci's Django. Back with Dollar in the Teeth, it was the first in a string of similarly titled rude boy rhythms that used spaghetti western imagery to evoke the music's outlaw aesthetic. And when Perry titled one track Clint Eastwood after the star of Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, he inadvertently started the spaghetti western naming trend. It's just a fun little thing. It's kind of like, one of those just little episodes in music history that Edwin Pouncey's picked up on, and I just found it a very entertaining little thing, because I have a soft spot, I have to admit, for spaghetti westerns and the music of spaghetti westerns, so it's interesting to me that kind of travelled to Jamaica
it's
and became
it's
something.
almost analogous to Wu-Tang's obsession with like kung fu.
Yes, very much.
It's very interesting.
Very much, yeah.
But Return of Django, wonderful stuff.
Yeah, well, that's it.
That's
my
great.
lot.
That's a great. I shall read that story. Well, I think we may be drawing to a close.
We're done.
We're done. We're saying more brusquely. We're done, mate. But it's been really wonderful speaking with you, Andy. Thank you so much for coming in. And
thank you. And I've really enjoyed it.
Career and your interests and musical tastes. It's
we can resume our conversation about British Trotskyism.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the real reason I'm here.
Wonderful. So finally, just to say, do visit Rock's Back Pages, where subscribers can read over 50,000 articles and listen to over 800 audio interviews with everyone from... Who is it? Everyone from
Arlia to ZZ Top.
Jimi Hendrix. Well, audio's from Jimi Hendrix to Kate Bush. Check to see if your local library subscribes to RBP, and if not, maybe suggest they take a free trial of the world's largest archive of music journalism. We will be back in a fortnight, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
That concludes episode 149 of the Rock's Back Pages podcast. Many thanks to special guest Andy Beckett. Find his books, including When the Lights Went Out, Britain in the 70s, in all good bookshops. The hosts are Barney Hoskins and Mark Pringle, and it was co-hosted and produced by Jasper Murison-Bowie. The Rock's Back Pages podcast is part of the Pantheon Podcast Network. You can find thousands of articles, as well as hundreds of full-length audio interviews, at rocksbackpages.com.